Hey guys, thanks for stopping by the channel. As you saw, the wood for the stringers came in, and I do have the wood for the transom in. The whole of the boat is prepped. That means it's time to finally cut these new stringers and get them installed. Now before we go ahead and install these stringers, there's a couple things I want to talk about. There's a couple things I want to cover on the wood itself. There's also a few things on the boat that I like to cover, kind of along the lines of how I plan to find the center point and get these stringers set and mounted up. But we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, let's talk about wood. For my stringers, they're 16 feet long, and I chose to go back with something dimensionally the same as what came out, which was a 2x6. And I'm using clear vertical grain Douglas fir. So it's the two boards up there at the top. I happen to have this other board here at home, and that's just a standard board that you can get at your local Home Depot or Lowe's. And I thought it'd be a great chance to lay it next to these other boards and show you the difference. So the clear vertical grain, it has requirements on the amount of knotting per foot on them. And also, if you notice on the end of the boards, the grain pattern is cut quite a bit differently than your standard big box store board. So what this will do for me is this wood has a lot more strength. It's also a lot more stable, so that it's less likely to warp, bow, or cup. And I can tell you, just if you look at these boards, I'm pretty sure the camera's not going to show it up, but this board is what you'd expect from a big box store where it's far from straight, and these two boards are pretty nice and straight. Now, at today's lumber prices, I paid about $140 per board here, and that was about $20. So there's absolutely a big price difference, but I've put so much work into this boat, and it's taken so much prep and time and money and fiberglass to get it to where I'm at. I'm not stopping short. I'm going to go ahead and use the better, more superior lumber because I want this repair to be permanent and last a long time. I really don't want to have to come back and do this job again. Now you can see this is the old starboard or passenger stringer that came out of the boat, and I was able to pull all the fiberglass encasement off of it, and it's actually pretty good. It's in decent shape. It's at least good enough to pull a template off of on the way that it's cut, and it tapers up to the bow. Unfortunately, on my boat, these stringers were 24 inches apart on the inside dimensions, and I'm going to go ahead and move the new stringers to 26 inches apart. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is it's going to go ahead and give me some more flexibility with engine mounting, and I won't have clearance issues. And also, it's going to help make things a little bit more stable with the wider stringer. The downside of that is it's pretty convenient when you have to put a floor in the boat, and they're 24 inches apart, because you can just get a 4x8 piece of plywood, rip it down the center, and you have enough for your floor. I'm thinking that by the time I go ahead and get my plywood and cut it for the floor, the other half of the plywood that's a little bit shorter, I'm going to be able to go ahead and use those for the bulkheads. So I think in the end, it's not going to cost me any extra lumber, just a little bit of planning on how I'm going to cut my lumber and where I'm going to use it. So let's take a minute and talk about boat prep. Earlier in my videos, I talked about how I put the boat on 3 jack stands, and now that I'm actually to the point where I'm going to install the stringers, I spent quite a bit more time to be sure that the boat was level. Now, I did all of my leveling and measurements from the bottom of the boat, not the inside. The inside of the boat doesn't matter. Everything should be taken from the bottom because that's the part that interfaces with the water. That's really what matters. So I had to raise the rear jack stands up in order to get this boat leveled. And you can see I have just this one orange stand here in the center on the keel. And I used just some door shims to go ahead and get this raised up and finalize my leveling of the boat. On those red jack stands that I have on either side, I mentioned in the previous videos, I only put those there and again added door shims on them to just barely be touching the boat, and I did that because there's no wood in the boat, and when I'm crawling in and out and working in the boat, it really helps stabilize it. Once I go and put these stringers in and have them bedded in, I'm going to go ahead and take those jack stands out so that way it's sitting on a true 3-point jack stand system. The reason why I'm doing this is with the 3-point jack stands is you want to do everything you can to minimize any distortion to the hull, because once you bed these stringers in and tab them in, it would be there permanently. That's why you don't want to do this on a trailer, and that's also why I'm going to pull those extra jack stands I have in out before I go ahead and bed them in. Now, while I was down here, I also took a chalk line and ran it down the center of the bow, and I ran that down the center of the keel all the way to the back of the boat and to the transom. Now, before I ran that chalk line, I went onto the center of the keel on the boat, and I actually measured on either side of the strakes, and I found the center point based on the strakes, and I marked that with blue painter's tape all the way down the boat. So then when I ran that chalk line down the bow line and down the boat, I had a reference point to measure it. So essentially is what I have now is I have a center point going down the keel of the boat, and I was able to take that and bring that, you can see it right back up here. I was able to mark the inside of the floor of the boat where the center line is and where it comes back over the transom. Now on the back side, I was able to pull measurements again off the strakes to the center from either side, and again find the center point of the transom. So with this chalk line, I have the center line of the keel and I have it to the transom, and I'm going to be doing my best to go ahead and install these stringers as center to the boat as I can. Again, not off the inside dimensions, but off the center point of the boat. Now fortunately, up on the keel near where that jack stand is, the gel coat's rubbed pretty raw from the boat going up on sandy beaches. So I was able to see through the fiberglass of the boat with a flashlight. So what I did is I had the chalk line up there on the center point underneath the boat. I put the flashlights on the floor shining up, and I was able to crawl in the boat and see roughly where that line was. So what I'm going to do from there is then go ahead and bring the chalk line to the inside of the boat from the center point up by the keel and match up to these points down here, and that will be close enough where I can use to get these stringers in the boat and centered. If you're enjoying this jet boat rebuild and you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I really appreciate it. It helps me out a lot. For those of you that have already subscribed, you've been commenting, liking the videos, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the nice comments. It means a lot to me. Keep them coming. Let's get back to the boat. Before running the chalk line on the inside of the boat, I laid down this blue painter's tape. That way I could go ahead and transfer the line with a pen to the tape and not worry about moving the chalk as I work on the rest of the repairs of the boat. Now I taped the chalk line up at the bow from the marks that I could see through of the gel coat, and then I had previously made some marks back on the pump opening that were there from when I ran the string underneath the boat. So I just lined those up, went ahead and snapped the line, and then went back and traced it with a marker, and you can see that when I go ahead and measure it here, I'm about 7 7/8 and just about 7 7/8. Like I mentioned, you don't really want to rely on measuring from the inside of the boat. You know, consider that I've been grinding on this. You don't know how many layers of fiberglass are there, and the inside of the boat doesn't really matter as compared to the part of the boat that's in the water. But that's just a good comparison to be sure that I am true, I am pretty close to center. And all the different measurements that I've taken from underneath the boat, on the back of the transom, and on the inside of the boat, all have matched up and aligned. So that tells me that I'm pretty good, I'm pretty centered, and I can use this as a center line to install my stringers. It's not that critical to have your stringers perfectly centered in the boat. I'm doing this just so that way I have a nicer, easier, and more accurate engine placement in relation to the pump. I figure a little bit of time spent here is going to pay dividends in the long run. I figure if I have the stringers fairly accurate and centered, I can also use those to help get the engine centered along with the center line. So in the end, it's a little bit of extra work, but I feel that it's worth it. So from here is what I need to do is go ahead and place the 2 new boards in the boat, and I'm going to come back and show you how I'm going to go ahead and get them traced and marked so I know how to get these cut so they have a nice, good, tight fit. All right, got the stringers in, they're positioned and leveled up and ready to be marked, so that way I know where to cut them so they fit the whole of the boat. But before we go and talk about getting them marked and how to get them to fit, I want to talk a little bit about how I have them positioned and what I did. So, like I mentioned, I moved these stringers so they're 26 inches apart opposed to the 24 inches that I had. Now I did actually move them out a little bit more, just about a 1/4 inch, so that way when I go ahead and tab them in and fiberglass them, the true inside dimension will still be 26 inches. So these boards that I cut to hold them are actually 26 1/4. And it was a little loose on the side, so I just used some door shims to go ahead and hold them tight, and that goes and keeps these boards 90 degrees to the hull of the boat, and it also keeps them pretty sturdy. As you can see, I don't have much movement in this. Now, what I did back here is my 2x6s are a true 5.5 inches tall, so I cut these boards out right here at 5.5 inches. And at the front of the boat, they're resting just straight on the fiberglass. Let's see if we can get a light in there. It's tight to see, but they're just resting on the fiberglass. So what we have essentially is the void underneath the stringers is the actual shape and size of the stringers that I need. You'll also notice that I went ahead and marked the center point of these 2x6s that I have supporting the stringers and holding their distance. And I use those to reference off the center point of the hole right down the keel that I did earlier. And also here on the back of the transom, I had to move the stringers forward because my transom has that 18-degree decline. So if I were to push the stringers back up on the transom, they actually wouldn't fit by the time I would cut them. So what I did is I used a normal carpenter square and I held it up flush on the bottom of the boat, and then I matched up the corner to the transom, and then I just made the corner of the stringers match that plane. I also took the same carpenter square and I ran it off the back of the transom to go ahead and square up the stringers and get them as squared and centered as I could. Now, I did that because that will change how you go ahead and cut these stringers depending on the shape of the boat. So if these stringers are off or crooked or not level, when I trace my line and then cut them, it's going to translate into the cut and I'm going to have a big gap. So I spent the time to make sure that these are as close to the true position they're going to be in, so that way when I mark them, I have a better cut. It's a little bit of extra work going about it this way, but I really wanted to make sure I have a nice, good fit on the first shot. So this is where it was important earlier in this the build when I got this boat leveled, because now the way the stringers are sitting, if I put a level on top of them, they're level, which is matching the level of the boat. Now remember, the boat is sitting on the 3-point jack stands. So I have the one jack stand under the keel, and then I have the two back there on the outside chines. Again, as I mentioned, I have these two red jack stands midway up on either side, and I have those there. They're not putting pressure on the hull. They're just there to avoid deflection when I'm getting in and out of the boat. So the hull is sitting in its natural resting position, and then I also have that floor jack there down on the center of the keel, because when I crawl up in there to mark these stringers, my weight's going to deform the hull, and I don't want that because that's going to change my marking. So I'm leaving those extra jack stands and the floor jack to give the hull, once it deforms, it's going to stop it and it'll be close to its natural resting position with my weight in there while I mark everything. So now we need to go ahead and transfer our marks from the boat to the stringer so we know where to cut them. So I took this piece of wood and I went ahead and rigged up some washers on there so they go ahead and spin. That bolt's just there to space them off. I measured up and drilled a hole at 5.5 inches. I tapered the hole so I can go ahead and set that pencil in. So this piece of wood, I can go ahead and run it down the hull of the boat, and the pencil essentially marks the top of the stringer. Since I have the stringer sitting up 5.5 inches, when I run this pencil down the length of the stringer, it's actually going to mark the bottom of the stringer to where the floor of the boat is. So all I have to do is run this along the floor of the boat, like this, and run my pencil down it, and that's going to go ahead and give me my cut line all the way on the stringer. Now I need to do this on both sides because the floor of the boat rolls in, so the inside is going to be a little bit deeper, and we'll address that when we go ahead and cut it to get it fit. But for now, I need to set the camera down, and I need to go ahead and mark both sides of these boards all the way up into the bow. When making my marks on the stringers, I'm being very mindful not to add any weight to the hull of the boat and not to cause any deflection. You can see that I'm making all the marks from the outside, and then I hopped in where the pump sits and made the marks on the inside. Now I was limited to the forward intersection of the stringers where I could not do this, so that's where I went ahead and had previously mentioned that I placed the extra jack stands on the outside midpoint of the boat and the floor jack on the center point of the keel. Now neither of those jack stands or the floor jack are adding any pressure to the boat. They're just there to prevent it from dropping down from my weight. Therefore there's no deflection of the boat, and I have a true good shape of the hull while making these marks. Okay, so the stringer's marked and out, and I went ahead and went over the pencil line with a Sharpie so you guys could see it a little bit better on camera. And you can see where the line essentially just tapers and follows right up into the bow of the boat and has a good curve. Now one thing to keep in mind when you go to cut this, as I mentioned, the boat is not flat as it curves. So if I stand this on end and you compare the outside of the stringer to the inside, you can see it's quite a bit of a different shape. So you really need to be careful when you go and cut this, because you have to cut essentially the inside off the inside line first, because that's going to be longer than the outside, and then you need to come back and address that side to give it the shape to lay up flat in the hole. So if I were to go ahead and cut on this outside line first, it would actually cut far too much material off on the inside, and I would never have a good fit. To get the stringer cut, I chose to use a skill saw, and I was cutting off of the inside line by freehand. I left the blade on the skill saw set at a 90-degree angle because of the curve of the stringer. It not only curls up and tapers towards the top of the stringer, but it has a taper to the outside. So it's almost like a compound curve on the front section of the stringer. And that curve is actually not consistent as the stringer tapers, so it would be very difficult to match that with one setting of the blade. So I figured it would be easiest just to go ahead and make one initial cut with the skill saw at 90 degrees, and I'll show you how I'm going to address the other sections of the cut here in a second. So you can see I went ahead and cut it with my skill saw, and I left the blade at a straight 90 degree. And now you can see real well how you have to pay attention to which side you're cutting, because if I were to cut off of the outside of the stringer, I would have been 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch too short and essentially ruined the piece of wood. So you can see it's really only up there in the front section of the bow, and then it tapers down. And even though I still have a bit of a line here, there's not much to it. Just a little bit up here, and then it just kind of fades away. So what I'm going to do is I'll probably take a jigsaw and angle the blade and cut this just to get the bulk of the wood away, and then I'll fine tune it with my angle grinder. And for these sections down here, I'll just hit those with the angle grinder, and I'll basically not take any wood off of this outer edge and just take this and bevel it to that shape, and then we'll just do some trial and error fitment into the boat and tweak it as we need. I have this stringer laying on the sawhorses with the outside facing up, and the initial cut that I made with the skill saw was on the inside, and I cut that to my line. So I use trial and error here to get the angle of the blade on the skill saw, and as what I'm doing is I'm cutting the stringer with the line on the outside, being sure that I'm not getting down and cutting any wood off of the other side of the stringer where the cut was made with the skill saw. Once I had that done, I took my 4.5-inch angle grinder and I went ahead and fine-tuned it, basically connecting the two lines and making them flat, giving the wood the angle it needed. Now also up towards the back side of the stringer where the cut was much smaller, I didn't do any cutting there at all, and I just fine-tuned it with the grinder. Once I had everything tuned in with the grinder, I went back with a DA sander, and I had a 24 grit sanding disc on that, and that really just let me fine-tune the angle on the stringers, because with the 4.5-inch grinder, it's pretty aggressive. It removes a lot of material quickly, and it's hard to get a nice smooth, even finish, nice transitions and radiuses. So with the sander, it's easier just to go back and kind of fine-tune it and get what you need. Now once I had that done, I went and set the stringers on the boat, and there was a few adjustments I made with sanding on them just to make sure that there was no high spots that were keeping it high off of the floor, and making sure that the contour of the stringer matched the hull of the boat the closest I could get it. Once I was happy with the fit of the port stringer, I needed to go ahead and repeat this process to cut out and shape fit the starboard stringer to the boat. I did the exact same steps, cut it with the skill saw, trimmed it with the jigsaw, fine-tuned it with the grinder and sander, and did a few test fits in the boats, a few small tweaks with the sanding, and I was pretty much ready to go. Alright, got them cut and installed on the first shot, and the fitment is really good. I'm really happy with it. There's not a big gap on the bottom. It's very manageable, and just the overall fit all the way up into the slope of the bow is very good. It's what I was looking for. So you can see that I went and put these boards back in, positioned them. I got the wedges to hold its height, and I centered it back up so that way I can confirm the right fit. Because the way the front of the bow moves up, if you move these stringers left or right, that completely changes the way they fit the floor of the boat. So that's why it's really important, even at this step, to make sure they're centered. The more time you spend with that centering, the better fit you're going to have overall. Another thing to keep in mind is the straightness of your boards. My port stringer here, driver's side stringer, that board was very straight, and I didn't have many knots to work around, so it was pretty simple on just putting it in. On the starboard side, passenger stringer, it had a couple knots that I needed to work around. Now, I didn't want to have those knots up in the front by the bow, because as I was cutting that board to make it fit, I'm losing thickness, and then those knots were not going to be able to be cut out, and I was worried about the overall strength of the board. So I felt that it was better to move the board back or flip it around so the knots would be back here, and I was sure that they're out of the engine box area. But because of that, I essentially only had one direction that I could install that board that I liked, and this board actually has a bit of a bow to it. So it's one thing to keep in mind when you're tracing out your boards, because that bow actually goes up rather than the bow down on the way it's installed. So you needed to take that into account when I had everything mocked up and I drew my line on it. But for now, I got them in, test fit's good, so the next steps are to pull them out, get the hole prepped, and get the bottom of these boards prepped before we go ahead and get them put in. Well, it's no surprise that my OCD came and got the best of me on this one. And I went and had the stringers centered up in the boat, and I was doing that measuring off of my center line that I put in earlier. As you can see, I went and took a laser level and I lined it up on my line all the way back to the line back behind the pump and on the transom and up the boat. And I did that because I wanted to make sure that they actually were truly centered in the boat. So, not sure if it picks up the line on the camera here, but it's pretty good and centered. And an added benefit with me having the center line marked on these support boards that I have to hold everything in place is I'm not only confirmed that I'm centered up on the line of the boat and my tape line centered back to the transom, but that center line overlays with the center line of those boards and my stringers are centered. Which, if you look carefully, my gap here from where this floor raises on either side is actually a little bit tighter on the starboard side of the boat. That's why you don't want to rely just on the inside of the boat to set the stringers, because it's not a true dimension that you can rely on. You need to pull everything from the bottom of the boat and then transfer that to the inside to get a true square set of stringers. So before I pull these stringers out and start working on getting them bedded in, one last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and mark on the floor of the boat where these stringers sit, so that way when I put them back in and I'm dealing with my fiberglass, I don't have to fight to get them positioned. I can get them 90% of the way there, and I just have to tweak them a little bit left to right to get them centered up and squared in the boat. Just like when I was making my marks on the stringers when I needed to cut them, I put a lot of effort into making sure that I wasn't leaning on the boat or placing any of my weight on it, because I did not want any deflection in the hull. Now, getting most of these marks done on the rear section or the open section of the boat was pretty easy and quite straightforward, honestly, but as you can see, when I start crawling up into the bow, with the support boards that I have in the center, there really wasn't much space at all to work with. It's tight up there anyways, but once I had the support boards and being able to see where I needed the mark and not move the stringers proved to be quite difficult. So I was removing those supports as minimal as I could, just giving me enough space to get up in there and mark them. And then once I had it marked, it was go ahead and fully disassemble everything. So the stringers are out of the boat for what I hope is the last time. And there's a couple things I want to talk about here that I did not mention earlier. And one of those is the radius I put on the tops of these stringers. So I went and hit them with a router with a 1/2 inch just rounded bit and rounded the top. Now I did that before I even cut the stringers. They were still just the raw wood, and that was actually the first thing I did. And the reason why I did that is because once I get these trimmed that fit up into the bow, you can see that it would be pretty much impossible to keep that router flat and get that routed. So if you were to go ahead and do the router work afterwards, you would have to stop short and do that by hand. So it's easier just to do that to start with before you cut the boards. It really has no bearing on the setup and getting everything mocked up. You do have to select which boards you want and which way you want them facing up before you router them. And the reason why we're doing that routering is just to go ahead and give that edge a nice round, smooth, easy transition. And that's going to help with our fiberglass when we go ahead and wrap it over it. If we were to leave it with the original dimensions of the wood, it's hard for that fiberglass to want to make that corner, and it will have a tendency to want to kind of roll up off of the board. So by doing so, it'll be easier to glass it up, and it just looks a little nicer. Now let's talk about water drains. You can see that I placed my water drains as far back as I could, all the way up against the back of the transom. And I did this because I didn't want any water sitting back there whatsoever. And also, if I moved them forward, I felt that it would just leave a weak section of wood there that would eventually break and crack. And if we go out and actually look at my original stringer, you'll see what I'm talking about. You can see back here where they had the water drain, and you can see that it already is cracking, and that crack goes all the way through the wood. And you can actually see that there's quite a bit of water damage back there, I suspect, from this hole. So even if you were able to seal up the inside of that hole, I don't like how it cracked. I don't like how the water got in. So my train of thought with my placement of the drains was, I don't have that wood that's going to crack and break off, and there's just less area there for water to get into, because hopefully the water will sit on the boat and go underneath and not get on the wood. All right, guys, that was a lot of stuff to cover, a lot of tips and things to consider when you're getting your stringers fit, cut, and installed into the boat. Really taking your time, thinking forward, thinking ahead, planning ahead is really going to help your installation go smoother, look cleaner, and be more accurate. On the next video, I plan on covering the bedding in, installation, and tabbing of the stringers, so do keep an eye on the channel for that video. I'll be releasing it here shortly. For those of you that are already subscribed, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the nice comments, the likes that you're giving me. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do. Take a look at my other playlists. I have plenty more content already posted and a lot more coming your way. Give me your likes. Share the video with your buddies. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video.